folks! Welcome to another video on planning for teaching, and welcome also to past Rachel Bitmoji up here. Sometimes I need an example of a student when I'm doing these videos, or I'm talking about back when I was a nurse, so past Rachel will be stepping in from time to time. I was blonde back in the day. This week in my class we're talking about planning for teaching, in particular writing our learning objectives as well as selecting appropriate teaching strategies. And in my last video up here I talked about writing learning objectives and Bloom's taxonomy. I also introduced the idea of selecting appropriate teaching strategies for those learning objectives, which we're going to talk about more here today. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about constructive alignment or instructional alignment, and then I'm going to pose some questions for you that you can ask yourself as an educator when you are selecting your teaching strategies. So you have your learning objective, and our learning objective guides the content or what is taught, the teaching strategy or how we teach the content, and the assessment strategies or how we assess our students' learning. And one of the things we want to ask ourselves here is about the instructional alignment. So is there that alignment between our intended learning objectives, our teaching strategies, and our assessment strategies? Since my course this semester is called Teaching Strategies for Health Professions Education, today I'm just focusing on that alignment between the learning objectives and the teaching strategies, but do be aware as educators that you also want to be thinking about assessment throughout your planning process. And this chapter here uses the example of swimming to illustrate this. So if in your learning objective you want your learners to be able to swim by the end of a learning session, then you need to pick a teaching strategy that's actually going to get your learners in the water and getting them in a pool. But if your learning objective is to show them that swimming is fun, you could invite people to come to your class to share their experiences with swimming, or you could show them videos or images of people having fun in the water. So these examples show constructive or instructional alignment between your learning objective and that teaching strategy. So for a more health professions education example, let's say that your learning objective is that by the end of a course, you want your learners to be able to apply their knowledge to deliver a baby with shoulder dystocia. For those of you who aren't in healthcare, shoulders getting stuck on the way out. So for this learning objective, you're going to need your learners to get out of the lecture hall and into a lab, likely to actually practice the skill, which would be reflected in the teaching strategy or strategies you pick. So simulation could be a great example of a teaching strategy that you may want to use to meet this learning objective. And then once they're in the clinical environment, whether they are doing preceptorship, practicum, residency, depending on your profession, you may use a different teaching strategy as well, such as experiential learning or mentorship, to assist in helping your learners work towards this learning objective of being able to deliver a baby with shoulder dystocia. Now, if your learning objective is that you want your learners to be able to understand laboring people's experience of shoulder dystocia, simulation probably isn't going to be the best teaching strategy. Although you can certainly bring in feedback from the patient into your debriefing. I think that narratives and storytelling would be a much more appropriate teaching strategy for this type of example. So here you can learn about the experience from the perspective of someone who's actually experienced shoulder dystocia themselves. So this would have better instructional alignment with your learning objective here. And now that we've drafted our learning objectives and we've brainstormed some potential teaching strategies, we want to consider the appropriateness and the feasibility of these teaching strategies. And the World Health Organization's Effective Teaching, a Guide for Educating Healthcare Providers, gives us a list of some really great questions that we can reflect on as educators. So the first question that they pose is the teaching strategy appropriate for the learning objective? So as we've kind of already discussed, we need to be picking teaching strategies that will help our learners meet our learning objectives. And the authors give the example of teaching students how to give an injection. In this case, we shouldn't give just a lecture, we should also give our learners the opportunity to practice the skill of giving an injection. Second, we need to ask ourselves are the resources that we need for this particular teaching strategy actually available to us? So some teaching strategies are going to require different supplies, different equipment, which we need to think about in advance. So what are we going to need, and is it actually available to us on that day? And often the teaching strategy or method that we use is going to be influenced by what resources are available to us. For example, the type of learning environment we have access to. The university where I did my nursing degree didn't have a sim lab at the time while I was going there, so high-tech simulations with the really fancy sim dolls was not an option for my professors, although we did have some very basic mannequins, which we all named Mr./Mrs. Chase. And so we may do with low-tech approaches. For example, we simulated doing wound care on boards that had laminated pictures of wounds on them. In a similar vein of thought, are special facilities required? For example, do you need access to a computer lab, to a simulation lab? If you're teaching in the hospital, do you need access to a meeting room or a conference room, something like that? Their fourth question is, what is the projected size of the class? So are you teaching 20 students versus 200 students? That's going to impact the type of teaching strategies you can use, and size of groups if you're going to divide your class up into smaller groups for that teaching strategy. For example, a case study is pretty easy to carry out in a larger class because you can subdivide the class into smaller groups. And I would also add that you may want to consider the projected class size in light of special facilities or resources you may need. So if you're doing a high-tech simulation with sim dolls, do you have enough for the various simulation groups? If not, how are you going to manage this? And their fifth question is there a special room arrangement that's needed for this method? So room arrangement is something I think about a lot when I'm teaching in person, probably because my first introduction to teaching was teaching swimming, and part of our lesson planning that we were taught to do was to draw out the formation we were going to have our learners in, which is important because when you're teaching beginner swimmers, which was my preferred group to teach, drowning is a very substantial concern. But even out of the pool and in other environments, it's really important to be taking that into consideration. And this week, my learners read an article that was looking at how learning theories translate into our classroom learning environments. For example, up here I have an example of what behaviorism may look like in the classroom. Using a teaching strategy that is more informed by something like andragogy may have your learners in more of a horseshoe formation. For something like social constructivism, you may have desks pushed together and having your learners in small groups. And a kind of a sub-question we have to ask ourselves here in terms of special formation within the classroom is that room arrangement for that particular teaching strategy even possible in that room? An example I always use for this is it's really hard to do teaching strategies involving small groups when you're teaching in a lecture hall, particularly when you're in one where the chairs and the tables are bolted to the ground and you can't move them. It is doable to do some group learning in an environment like that, but it is quite challenging. So something like a think, pair, share may work a little bit better because then they can talk to people that are next to them. I've done role play in really small groups in a teaching environment like this. So there's ways you can adapt to that. If you can't rearrange the room, you may need to look into whether or not you can book another room for your teaching. And if not, you may need to change up the teaching strategy a bit. And then their final question is whether the method that you've selected will stimulate interest and provide variety. So change up your teaching strategy to keep things fresh and fun in your classroom. And I would also add here to consider Bloom's taxonomy. Odds are your learning objectives aren't looking at all the same cognitive process domains, so they will call for some different teaching strategies. One additional consideration that I want to add in health professions education, we do exclusively teach adults if you're teaching other healthcare professionals. So something you may also want to consider when you're planning for your teaching and selecting your teaching strategies is bringing in principles of adult learning, also known as andragogy or adult learning theory, although it isn't technically a theory. And while principles of adult learning is no longer considered to just apply to adults, and of course not all adults learn the same, it outlines 6 assumptions about adult learning that we can apply to our teaching, such as the experiences of adult learners being a very rich resource for learning within the class. I do have a video on andragogy which talks more about this, which I'll link down below in the video description, and I'll put it up in the cards if I remember. And that's all for now, folks. I hope this video helped you make a little bit more sense of instructional alignment, planning your teaching, selecting teaching strategies, things like that. Please let me know if you have any questions, and as always, I will see you all online.